Okay, welcome to the next edition of the SNA Speakeasy. And today we're going to take on a topic from the politics of Taiwan. And we have a very, very appropriate and knowledgeable guest for this kind of a topic. And that is our SNA's partner organization, New Bloom editor, Brian Hioe. Or is it Hioe or Hioe?
Hugh.
Hugh.
Might as well be Hugh.
Okay,
Sorry to
totally,
pronounce.
totally missed that one. All right, and so we're going to speak about the opposition party today, the main opposition party at the moment, which it goes by a number of different names. We usually on the SNA page translate it as the Chinese Nationalist Party, but a lot of people call it either the Kuomintang or the KMT. And I don't know exactly what Brian will use, but we'll find out soon. And why are we talking about an opposition party? I mean, they're out of power. Well, because they're a very interesting opposition party. They don't function exactly like other opposition parties necessarily do, and the political stakes in Taiwan are different than they are in a lot of other countries. And I think we're going to try to touch on those things. After the main interview between myself and Brian, we'll then move it to the question and answer period where SNA patrons are able to ask their own questions of Brian, but we'll get to that a little bit later. But first of all, thank you, Brian, for joining us. And
Thanks for having me.
first of all, let's assume that most of our audience who are Japan-focused people really don't know about this political party. So why don't you kind of give us the basic introduction? Where did they come from? What kind of party are they in the past, and what are they now?
So this is a kind of complicated history. I usually refer to it as the KMT because that's what the party refers itself generally as nowadays. Which, Kuomintang is an abbreviation for China, or KMT is an abbreviation for Kuomintang, which means Chinese Nationalist Party. So this is actually a party with around 100 years of history. It came to Taiwan after its defeat to the Chinese Communist Party in the Chinese Civil War. Before that, it was one of the political parties operating in China. It was fighting with the Chinese Communist Party for control of China. But it lost. It came to Taiwan and brought with what became 10% of the Taiwanese population. This is a sub-ethnic group known as Waishimen. And these were people that came from China after the Chinese Civil War, and Taiwan was previously populated by the 2% indigenous population and the 88% population of the Han Chinese, but descended from prior waves of immigration. And so, there are quite a lot of Taiwanese today that are actually descended from members of the KMT and people that came with the party to Taiwan. That even includes me. During the authoritarian period in Taiwan, it ruled over Taiwan as a one-party state. It was the only party then. It carried out a period of terror known as the White Terror against dissidents, intellectuals, and so forth. And at one point, that was the longest martial law period in the world. But Taiwan democratized in the 1980s and the 1990s. Today's even the anniversary of a student movement in 1990, which was a civilian occupation. This was a key event in democratization. But the thing that's quite interesting is that the KMT was still allowed to exist as a political party after democratization. It's still around. It still runs for elections. And so it's interesting that what once was a party in which you had the two dictators, Chiang Kai-shek and his son, Chiang Ching-kuo, now actually still runs in office, still around. And even some of the presidents that is had in power, Ma Ying-jeou, for example, he actually opposed democratization back in the day during that period. Yet later on, he himself ran for president and won. So you have these kind of interesting contradictions of Taiwanese history there. And so the KMT, its main opponent is the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, which is a center-left party in Taiwan. This DPP is a party that came out of the democracy movement. It was historically close to social movements, and it leads in the direction of political independence. You have this identity split in Taiwan between, for example, people that identify with Taiwan exclusively and people that identify with China. The KMT is a party that came from China after the Chinese Civil War. It continues to advocate the unification of Taiwan and China. And the people that came with it oftentimes, sometimes they do still identify with China, whereas others may not. And so, people are descended from of my age who are in their 20s and 30s that are Waishimen of this sub-ethnic group that came with the KMT might not necessarily identify with China, but a lot of the older members of the party do. And so then that leads us to this very interesting contradiction in Taiwanese politics, where you have one political party that literally hopes for the country to cease to exist, to become part of China. In the past, this for the KMT meant retaking the Chinese mainland militarily through basically just reconquering China from the Chinese Communist Party. But as time went on and this became increasingly difficult to accomplish, the party became on unification at all costs, even if it would be that the KMT would not be the controlling party that ruled over China in that form. I think there are a number of explanations as to why this shift occurred. I think my explanation would probably be because the KMT came over, it constituted an elite ruling party with a political and economic elite. And so, the people within the party sometimes do believe that they would be able to preserve their privileges if Taiwan became part of China. Sometimes they will even view it as actually through democratization, they lost their privileges. And so, for example, I myself am from a KMT family. And so I feel like I see this viewpoint among family members even.
Okay, well,
so,
let's
yeah,
slow it down and take some strands there.
yeah.
So, first of all, so you mentioned that there was this period, a long period of dictatorship in which the KMT was in power, and that
Mhm,
in the 80s and 90s this broke down.
mhm,
So I guess the first question is, why or how was the KMT forced to accept democratization, which allowed at least some part of power and eventually the ruling, the top offices to slip out of its hands? So
mhm.
how were they forced to do that?
So there was a rising democracy movement. That movement was what led to the formation of the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party. And so the KMT, it didn't struggle to the end. It willingly relinquished power in that sense. It allowed for democratization to happen rather than, it's sometimes phrased as Taiwan's peaceful transition to democracy. But this also led to some contradictions. For example, the KMT is accused of still having undue influence in some sectors of government, for example, regarding the police or the military or within banking. The KMT preserved a lot of assets from property seizures during the authoritarian period. And so what it did was that sometimes it would take these assets and put them into private hands of party members that were trusted to maintain this. And so the KMT did take steps because it knew that it just couldn't resist in the face of resistance from the public. And so I think that's one of the interesting things about Taiwanese democracy, that it was won through a struggle. And so people really kind of cling to their democratic freedoms in that sense. But at the same time, even the former authoritarian party will try to take credit for democratization. They'll say that we actually had a key role in this. We realized that this needed to happen, that this was the way to reform. And reform is maybe then the continual question facing the KMT up until now, which includes, I think, in this set of elections, the
Okay.
chair elections.
Then let's go on to the next question. You already noted that it's very unusual or odd that a
Mhm,
party which that ran an iron-fisted dictatorship for many
mhm,
decades has then been accepted as a legitimate democratic party after a period of democratization, where you know half or
mhm,
close to half of the population says we're going to vote for this party that used to rule us dictatorially. How did they make that?
mhm,
How did they make that jump and be accepted in that way? What's the explanation for their enduring popularity?
mhm. It's one of those things actually, which I think is quite interesting. I think that particularly when you look at who votes for the KMT, there's this kind of ethnic split, sub-ethnic split. But then actually you find sometimes that the most oppressed groups under the KMT are its most diehard supporters. People who are kind of longing for stability. I think the KMT is still credited by many people for Taiwan's economic successes during the kind of economic boom period, during the era of manufacturing, of made in Taiwan and that kind of thing. And so there are people that are still willing to trust the party because of that. It really banks on its reputation for being able to develop the economy and so forth. I think that maybe just willpower was not sufficient to actually remove this party from power, to dissolve it in some form. I mean, probably as you see is the case with a lot of democratization in many countries. Sometimes the former members of the authoritarian party end up kind of constituting a new party, a different party, and they still continue to be active in politics. But the KMT was allowed to kind of continue broken in this sense. I think a lot of it actually can also be credited to that the international community was too willing to accept Taiwan as having democratized. That the claim that Taiwan is these issues are resolved and the KMT is now a normal party, and people say something like Samuel Huntington's two turnover test, that if a political party transitions. There's two political transitions of power. This means the country is democratized. I think when you look at generally East Asia or even Southeast Asia, a lot of countries that are claimed to be democracies actually are not really very democratic, and they actually just have a history of, for example, one party ruling since World War II, continuously unbroken, but they are still termed democracies, and I think that's also what you see in Taiwan
Hmm.
in many cases.
Now, turning to the issue of how this relates between Taiwan and mainland China,
Mhm.
having read some of your work, I know that a lot of the KMT's policy today is related to something called the 1992 Consensus.
Mhm.
Can you explain what is that and what is it? How does it relate to the KMT's policies today?
Mhm. So the 1990 consensus is kind of the main plank on which the KMT claims its cross-strait policy between Taiwan and China will be conducted, and the KMT claims that the agreement there is one China, but respective interpretation of the China, two interpretations of that China. And for China, this is the People's Republic of China, and for Taiwan, this is the Republic of China, which are two separate entities. The Republic of China is the government of China in exile that the KMT brought with it as part of the government maintained to Taiwan. Um, but this is actually not really the same interpretation of China. China just claims the one China principle, that there is just one China. And the interesting thing about the 1990 consensus is that this was a term that only came up around 2000 with Taiwan's democratization and the first direct set of elections and the coming to power of the first non-KMT president, who is a DPP president. And so it's actually a question: did this actually ever exist? It was claimed that the 1990 consensus was an agreement reached by Taiwan and China through talks, which took place in 1992. But this was only publicly revealed in 2000, which has always made it a question: is it actually just something that was made up after the fact? Suchi, who was the person in the KMT that conducted the talks, the official that did that, stated later that he did actually just make this up as a way to facilitate the smooth transition of power between the KMT and the DPP. And so this is one of those things. And so the KMT has historically claimed that because it is the party of the 1990 consensus, it can maintain stable cross-strait relations with China, whereas it will depict the DPP as being a independence-leaning party. The DPP historically has been a pro-independence party. Independence is actually written to the party constitution. It claims that the DPP will upset cross-strait relations, and so then it used the 1990 consensus as saying that this is the framework we'll conduct relations on. This is the way to have peace with China and be able to conduct economic trade without China invading and taking over, what have you. At the same time, it's still a party that hopes for the eventual unification of Taiwan and China in some form, and one observes these attempts to move Taiwan closer to China in past years.
So, in the democratic period of the last 2 decades or so,
Hmm.
how does the KMT conduct itself in terms of domestic policy? You know, what kinds of what kind of cultural attitudes do they have, and from which sections of society do they gather their most support?
So this is actually something that's very interesting. The DPP is the center-left party, and the KMT is the center-right party. But the defining issues that separate them are actually which one leans in the direction of independence and which one leans in the direction of unification. And so it's actually interesting that they became this way, because independence and unification are not necessarily left-right issues. The KMT, my explanation is that the KMT, it's a party of the status quo, and so that aligned it much more with conservatism. That is to say, preserving the current status quo or returning to a prior status quo. Whereas the DPP, because it's leaning in the direction of independence, of changing things, of becoming more distant from China, and of democratizing and moving away from the party state, that became the party of change, progressive change, and so it became this kind of unusual mixture. The KMT, it's another reason maybe why it is more center right is because if you are a business interest, for example, the Chinese market is bigger. It's always in your incentive to have closer relations between Taiwan and China. And so in this way, you can actually operate in both markets. Someone like Terry Goh, the owner of Foxconn, is part of the KMT or affiliated with KMT, has been a member in peers in the past. And so that's why you have this kind of alignment. So I think then you can see the support of the KMT sometimes does come from these pro-China businessmen that conduct business between Taiwan and China. They might be Taiwanese, but they might own factories in China. They might have Taiwanese managerial staff in Taiwanese companies, but the production for their companies is in China or in Southeast Asia or places like that. And so then there's this kind of different, I guess, backing for both parties, in which the DPP is usually backed by more, let's say, small to medium business owner, size business owners or enterprise owners, and so forth. And then with the KMT, then you also have people that are an important demographic for their support is people that are public servants, teachers, police, and military. And these were people that constituted a elite under the KMT in return for political loyalty. They were paid off with generous pensions in return for that. So people working in, the government or in the police or the military historically have sided with the KMT because of this. I think, again, to the history of the party state.
It sounds to me kind of if there was no China issue, one China unification issue, that both parties might break down in different ways. They might realign in some ways where both these parties, maybe in some future where that issue's off the table, um, might both break up. Is that something you would see as well?
I think so. If the KMT ceased to exist, I mean, the KMT has been in continual crisis basically since 2014, in which there was the 2014 Sunflower Movement, a student-led occupation of the legislature against the trade deal that the KMT was trying to sign with China, a free trade agreement. Um, but then, if the KMT ceased to exist entirely, the question is what would happen to the Taiwanese political spectrum? And my own view is that the DPP is itself, although it is a center-left party, it's a party with two wings, both a left wing and a right wing. And so the party might even split because of that. The DPP, in its origins in the Taiwanese democracy movement, was formed out of groups that aligned with each other in opposition to the KMT. In so many ways, they're defined by their opposition to the KMT. And because of the fact that because they're more independence-leaning, this became aligned with the center-left. But in itself, the DPP does have a left and a right. And you can even have like very left in the DPP and also very right. And so I think if the KMT did not exist, it would just break apart and become two parties. And particularly with young people entering politics after the Sunflower Movement, forming new parties or becoming young politicians within the DPP, you can see that they're much more to the left of other elements of the DPP, and this is kind of provoking new splits.
Okay. Bring us up to 2020. So, what's going on right now with the KMT, and what are the biggest issues that they're grappling with?
So the biggest issues now, which also were reflected in the chair election, is how to change the party's pro-China image, and also to try to win back over young people, and in that way to retake power. The KMT has historically leveraged on the claim that it is the only party able to maintain cross-strait relations with China. However, with the rise of, for example, Xi Jinping, with increasing authoritarianism in China, Taiwanese are increasingly cautious of closer ties with China. And the KMT still maintains this political platform of eventually realizing some form of unification, as continue with efforts to bring Taiwan closer to China and so forth. And in that way, it's really lost the support of young people. And so that means that the party would be eventually a party without a political future. 2014, like I mentioned, there was the movement, the month-long occupation of the legislature in protest against the KMT-led free trade agreement. Since then, one has seen the Tsai administration from the DPP take power as the second non-KMT president, the second DPP president. But also, this was the first time that a non-KMT political party had the majority in the Taiwanese legislature. The KMT had always held the majority in the Taiwanese legislature until 2016. And so the KMT did actually manage to make some comebacks in 2018 because of voters trying to punish the DPP, I think, for slow economic growth and undoing labor reforms and that kind of thing. But it still fundamentally just has not been able to resolve this issue that voters are cautious of it because of its desire to have closer ties with China. And this flares up as an issue whenever there's a set of elections. And so that was kind of the difference. That's kind of the issue that's facing now, which is particularly flagged by, I think, the Hong Kong in the last year as well.
Are there actually a lot of people in the Taiwanese public who look forward to and welcome reunification with China? Is it really a huge constituency in the country anymore, or is it that they just want good relations?
It's very interesting because I think it differs from a lot of people. Young people overwhelmingly identify exclusively as Taiwanese, and they don't want unification with China. But there are a lot of older people who are, for example, might be from KMT families and that kind of thing, that do hope for unification in China. And the other thing is because the KMT is backed by these kind of wealthier conglomerates and business interests, that gives it an advantage, for example, in terms of the media. A lot of the media is actually owned by these conglomerates that do business with China and use their platforms to broadcast positive views of China. And so I think that's one of those things. I think the majority of the public does not support innovation in China, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that they won't vote KMT either, and that's maybe what's the dangerous thing. They will try to vote KMT as a way to punish the DPP for its perceived failings, or they actually just don't really view the KMT as able to realize some version of unification in China. They believe that actually just having the KMT in power will just drag out the process longer, and it will maintain stable relations with China, and this way it won't be a threat. I think it just really depends. For some people, it's a very abstract notion. For some people, it's a much more concrete notion of unification with China.
But you think that with the younger generation, this concept is pretty much dead? of a reunification of China, that they will support Taiwan as an independent country going forward.
I think so. I mean, that is can be described as supporting maintaining the status quo, not necessarily a formal declaration of independence, which could disrupt the region, cause regional tensions, cause immediate reprisals militarily from China. But Taiwanese young people overwhelmingly do not want to become part of China. And so this is even, again, the issue in the KMT chair elections in which we had two candidates, one that is much younger and one that was much older. And so the young people in the party aligned behind the younger candidate in the hopes that he would change the kind of cross-strait platform of the party in some way.
All right, well then let's move on to that point right there. Who in the KMT should we really be keeping our eyes on now as important people guiding its policy going forward?
That's actually one of the very interesting things because there are two candidates in this set of elections. There's Johnny Chang, who won, and he's 48 or 47. And then there was Hao Longbing, the former mayor of Taipei, who he's up against, who's 68 or 68. And so there's about a 20-year difference between them. And what's interesting is that both argued similar policies, but it was the younger one who won by overwhelmingly. He won overwhelmingly, 3-1 basically. He had around 66% of the vote. And so there's that. The younger candidate won. And he was viewed, I think, particularly among much international reporting on the election as a reformer, someone who changed the party. But again, one notes that both of their policies were not so different. Both of them talked about changing the party to fix its pro-China image, appealing to young people, and so forth. Behind Johnny Chang were young people within the KMT. There are younger politicians that sought to actually call for reform within the party after the Sun Farm, noting that their peers of the same age were so against this party, which they were a part of, that the KMT had lost young people, and so it would have to change if it wanted to appeal to them. But then there were actually attempts to dismiss them, to call them, traitors who had betrayed the party, its core values, that they were turncoats who had sold out to the DPP and the Pan-Green camp, and so forth. And actually, originally there was backlash against them that led to some of these youth reformers being kicked out of the party. And it was actually the former president who was in power during the Sun Farm, Ma Ying-jeou, who still continues to play an important role in the party, who was the one who took the initiative to bring them back into the fold. He realized, I think, after being opposed by a youth movement, that young people are necessary. You need to actually, try and win them back over. But then there's still the party traditionalists and the several of the chairs who won in interim between Johnny Chang and 2014, in which there was the Sunfire Movement, such as Hong Xiuzhu or Wu Zhuani, past chairs, were actually hardliners. And so the KMT tried to return to party fundamentals in response to these calls for reform at times. And so I think that actually, that's the thing that's interesting. Even in the wake of the chair elections, there are not actually that many young voices who have made themselves known as people to keep an eye on. There are young people in the party, such as Xu Qiaoxing, who's a city councilor in Taipei, who is someone that called for reform, for example, or Alfred Lin, who is the former head of the KMT Youth Corps. And these are people that I would think normally should be someone you should keep an eye on in a normal functioning party as someone that will eventually become important in 10 or 15 or 20 years. But the KMT has not really had this ability to advance young people within the party. Is question, will this change now that Johnny Chang is in power? And I'm not so sure that's going to happen. He's definitely going to meet resistance from party traditionalists. Someone who is still a contender in the party is, for example, the former presidential candidate, Han Guoyu, who is still the mayor of Kaohsiung. And there are calls for him to run for chair as well, despite the fact that he had lost in his presidential bid. Yet he didn't throw his hat into the race. And so he is someone who could potentially still be a player within the party. He still has a lot of support from party traditionalists. And if so, someone like him could actually just come in and maybe put an end to these attempts at reform.
Well, when you say reform, I'm not getting a clear idea. What is it they want to reform?
So that's also a question, is what they would reform. So the priorities would be clear, again, winning back young people, changing cross-strait policy in some form. And beyond that, it's unknown what else it would take place. And it's also unknown how the KMT would actually get there. What's interesting is that one day before the chair elections, there's an article in the Financial Times which said that whoever won, whichever chair won, that the KMT would actually drop the 1992 consensus. It would try to create some kind of new way, a new platform for cross-strait policy. And that's interesting that the timing of the article is one day before the election. That suggests that this was quite deliberate, that this news was released deliberately. But actually, as soon as Johnny Chang took office, he began backing away from the notion of dropping the 1992 consensus. And so originally the claim was that whoever won, Johnny Chang or Hao Longbing, who is probably a little more traditional, he's the older candidate, the 1900 consensus would be dropped. However, it just seems that the KMT backed away from this right away. And so it seems like all this reform, all of this was just actually talk, which is sort of what I expected to begin with.
Okay. And before we move it to the patrons, is there any other points you'd like to make about the KMT that I haven't asked you about so far?
I think that what I would point out is maybe that this is a party in crisis. It's a party that's been in crisis for 6 years, even more than that. And so I think what happens now is that there's periodic oscillations between calls for reform and calls for returning to party fundamental. So these are two responses to this crisis. And right now we're in kind of a reform phase, but it might swing back the other way towards party traditionalism in the future. And I think also just that these calls for reform from the new chair will encounter very heavy difficulties from party traditionalists. For example, one-fourth of the KMT eligible voters within the party are part of the military, part of a military branch that's given special privileges within the KMT that is a remnant of the party state. And so the groups like that will be very resistant to change within the party. And so I think that we'll have to see what happens from there.
Okay, thank you very much. So at this point, we're going to open it up to the patrons. Those of you who might want to ask questions, please send us a chat notice, which has a question mark, so I'll know to call on you.